Innsmouth, stranger.
Greetings, friends, and welcome to our 66th excursion into Innsmouth. As you can see, we've brought you directly into the town square again. Please do take care as you get off the bus there. The pavement is a little bit slippery, as it often is in Innsmouth. I'm one of your guides, Rob Poyton.
And I'm the other one, Tim Mendes. Yeah, and apologies if I stumble over my words even more than usual. I've just got back from Dr. Gilman's dental surgery around the corner.
Oh, so, I was going to say your face was looking a bit puffy there. I didn't want to question too much because, but an Innsmouth dentist, that's a terrifying prospect.
Yeah, it's not pleasant. Somebody with scaly fingers putting them in your mouth. It's rather unpleasant, I can tell you. But he's done a decent job of me filling. So what can you do?
Does he have one of those sort of foot pedal operated drills? That's what I imagine.
Oh, yeah. But there's a lot of brass in there. There is a lot of brass and a lot of tubes and contraptions that wheeze.
Nice.
Nice. Yeah.
So just before we go into Tim's shop today to talk about our story, I just wanted to say another quick thank you to everyone who backed the recent Innsmouth Gold anthology, or our latest anthology, The Pickman Papers, which I'm pleased to say is now out and available via Amazon and similar good booksellers. And I think we were both blown away by the response to this because it funded on the first day on Kickstarter.
Yes, it's insane. Yeah, I've never known anything like it, to be honest. It funded on like the first day, and every time I went back, it's like, oh, there's more. There's more.
Yeah. So yes, that's available now, and all the backers should have received their copies. And again, I'm really made up with the artwork on this one. I think Graveheart Designs did an excellent job. It's such atmospheric artwork in there.
Absolutely, yeah. It looks great. I had to take a picture of it when mine turned up in the post. I had to put it next to my Cthulhu statuette and my Cthulhu drinking goblet and all that. It's like, it just looks right.
All right, so let's go into the shop, shall we?
Yep, come in, make yourselves comfortable. You might have to move stacks of mouldering tomes out of your way. If you see any sort of worm-like creatures, just brush them onto the floor. I'll catch them later. There seems to have been a bit of an outbreak lately of small wriggly things getting into my shop. I don't know why.
Have you had vermicular infestations?
Yes, indeed, a vermicular infestation. That's a band name.
There's another band name, isn't it?
Yeah. Sit down. Today we're going to be looking at a bit of a classic of neo-Lovecraftian fiction, I guess you'd call it, sort of second wave, I guess. We're going to be looking at TED Klein's Black Man with a Horn. It was originally published in New Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos from Arkham House in 1980 and was, of course, edited by Mr. Ramsey Campbell. I'm going from the 1988 Grafton reprint, which has got an absolutely superb cover.
Yes.
It's got a scantily clad woman in stockings and suspenders looking horrified as some monstrosity makes its way towards the camera.
Yeah, I remember buying that one, actually. That would have been, like I say, sort of early 80s. That was yeah, there was that, and Tales of the Cthulhu Mythos, I think, was
yes, that was the original one. Yeah, this was the follow-up. There was that one that was August Derleth edited.
Oh, right,
yeah.
right, yeah.
And then there was one after this, which was Tales of the Lovecraft Mythos, which was edited by Robert M. Price.
Oh, I don't think I've seen that one. I've certainly not got that one.
No, it's a good one. It's some good stuff in it. It's got a couple of stories by Henry Kuttner in it that are actually quite hard to find, so it's well worth picking up for them alone.
And the edition I brought with me is the collection called Dark Gods, which was put out in 1985. And that's a collection of Klein's novellas, including Children of the Kingdom, P.T., Black Man with a Horn, and Nadelman's God.
Yeah. It's a brilliant collection.
And we were just speculating about differences in text, but perhaps we'll talk about that when we come to that particular part.
Yeah. Before we start, I've got to ask you now. This is what I've been holding off asking you. I've got to ask you, how long did you spend looking at jazz album covers?
Not very long, I have to say.
I spent hours.
Right.
Hours going through.
I didn't go down that particular rabbit hole, but you're looking at sort of John Coltrane and that kind of thing.
Oh,
yeah.
I did.
Yeah.
Oh God. Yeah. John Coltrane, because he's mentioned, but there's no album cover that works of his. But
Right.
there is one with Miles Davis. And obviously, Miles Davis released the album Man with a Horn.
Right.
And he was actually a horn player, whereas Coltrane wasn't, even though
was
he's
a
a
saxophonist.
saxophonist. Yeah.
I guess the saxophone is what fits the graphic more.
Yes.
With that sort of trunk-like idea. Or yeah.
Indeed. Yeah. But the nearest I got was Kulu Si Mama from 1967, which was a John Coltrane album. There's a couple of Miles Davis and John Coltrane albums that fit the bill.
Right.
Not quite, but almost. But the one that comes nearest was a 1970s print of a Sonny Rollins album called Saxophone Colossus. So there you go.
That's quite a good band name in itself, obviously.
Isn't
an
it?
album name.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, well, I mean, we're jumping ahead a little bit, I suppose, but isn't it described at one point like a sort of ram's horn?
Yeah.
Almost got the idea of a sort of ancient horn rather than the saxophone thing. So, but I suppose that's part of the ambivalence or the nothing is quite certain in mythos stories. Yeah.
I love that fact. And to be fair, it could be a random bootleg or something. You know?
Yeah.
Because you've got to think these albums, a lot of them, there's so many different issues of them, and there's bootlegs and God knows what out there. So
yeah, something might turn up. Yeah, if anyone out there does know of a cover that corresponds to this, then send it in. Do let us know. So TED Klein, his real name is Theodore Donald Klein, but he added the extra name Ibon in honor of Clark Ashton Smith, so it became Theodore Ibon Donald Klein.
Nice.
Also, of course, with the pun there that his initials are his first name, TED Klein. So he was born in 1947 in New York. He studied at Brown University, where he wrote an honour thesis on H.P. Lovecraft, which must have been quite unusual back in the day. I would say it's probably less strange now, but back then I can imagine that would have been quite an unusual thing. And something I didn't know about him was in 1975, he and some friends came up with the idea of the World Fantasy Convention, the first one of which was held in Providence.
Really?
Appropriately enough, and was mostly based around Lovecraft. So there you go, people inventing their own Lovecraftian conventions. Who'd have thunk it? I wonder if anyone's ever done that in the UK.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because obviously Worldcon is in Glasgow next year.
Right.
And I'm scheduled to go. But they've changed the award because it was, until very recently, the award was a bust of H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
Well, they changed it. Now it's August Derleth. It's now the August Derleth Award. So there you go. Yeah.
Klein's first notable story was Events at Poroth Farm in 1972, which in 1984 was expanded to the novel The Ceremonies, which I think we spoke about that briefly last time.
Yeah. It's an amazing story.
And he does this, as we'll see in this story, this sort of mixing Lovecraft in with the fiction as fact, and it's very interesting. Now, Klein hasn't really written a lot else because, to quote himself, he often suffers from writer's block and he doesn't really enjoy the process of writing very much. I think he said The Ceremonies took him like 5 years to write. So, unfortunately, we've not got a lot more in terms of fiction from him, though in 2019, Hippocampus Press published Providence After Dark, which is a collection of Klein's essays and articles. I think that's S.T. Joshi put that together.
Indeed.
So that's probably worth checking out. So let's get into the story. And what I liked about this with the opening was, if I just read this first sort of sentence or so, there is something inherently comforting about the first person past tense. It conjures up visions of some desk-bound narrator puffing contemplatively upon a pipe amid the safety of his study, lost in tranquil recollection, seasoned but essentially unscathed by whatever experience he's about to relate. And that's nice because straight away that sort of sets us in Lovecraft country, doesn't it?
Oh yeah.
Or the M.R. James or everything else where the story has been narrated. So if it's been narrated, we know that the protagonist survived it.
Yeah, but there's a good subversion, isn't there? In a couple lines down, because he says, it's a tense that says, "I am here to tell the tale. I lived through it." But then just a little bit further down, he starts talking about that this may be the last thing he ever writes.
So the tale is not quite over yet, is the impression we're getting. He's still living this experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Which again is very Lovecraftian, this idea of you go there and something happens. In standard sort of adventure stories, I don't know, you go to King Solomon's mines or whatever, you get the treasure, you come home. In Lovecraft or M.R. James, again, you go there, you get the treasure, something comes home with you. And a bit later goes, hello.
A pen wiper, yeah.
So I found that quite engaging, straight away you think, oh, what's going on here, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's something you notice straight away about his style. It's something I remember from reading the ceremonies and things like that, is it's very meta. There's a lot of fourth wall breaking, but it's done in a very unobtrusive way. It's not done in the way, because often I find that kind of thing, it's almost like it's too clever for its own good. It often comes off quite smug when people do it sometimes, I feel. But the way he handles it, it enhances the story. It doesn't diminish it.
Yeah, it seems very natural. It does.
Yeah.
Oh, and we should mention, of course, that the story does open with a Lovecraft quote.
Indeed.
Which says, or is written as, "The black, words obscured by postmark, was fascinating. I must get a snapshot of him." And that was Lovecraft to E. Hoffman Price, 7/23/1934 in American date. That always confuses me. 23rd of July. But the interesting thing is, what that letter actually said was, "The black kitten was fascinating." So.
Yeah, that's a lovely touch, isn't it? It's the in-jokes have started already. It's
obviously kitten doesn't sound as menacing as the black. What could it be? So yeah. Clever.
Yeah, I like the way that the instead of just getting like a tentacle or a few stars as scene breaks, we get Lovecraft quotes as scene breaks.
Yeah, it's a nice use of them. Yeah. And our setting is this sort of quite mundane suburban room or house that he's living in, with a desk, electric typewriter, drone of the old air conditioner. And everything sounds a little bit sort of run down. The fence is overgrown with weeds. Everything's just a little bit shabby.
Yeah, cheap wicker furniture, dull, outdated books. The night pressing in from outside. So I love that. It's that sort of melancholy, isn't it? That shabby melancholy.
Yes. And so he starts to recount his story, and it begins again. We get another Lovecraft quote. "That, boy, was what I call a travel experience," and that's the 3rd of December 1930. I've not been able to track down, without going through all the letters, which letters these are extracted from, these quotes. I think one of them we might have covered on Strange Shadows. That seemed familiar.
Yeah,
but of course Lovecraft wrote thousands. So
I would have thought, the way he says "boy," that he would be talking to the inspiration for this story,
Mr. Long.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Mr. Long, because I think it's probably a good place as any to say it, that the main character, the narrator, is based upon Frank Belknap Long.
Yes.
So
yeah. And I didn't know that when I first read it. And as we get through and we find out his age and everything else, I have to say I didn't think of Long immediately. I was thinking of Block.
Right. Now, Block would have still been still younger.
Yeah, youngest, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because S.T. Joshi writes in Icons of Horror and the Supernatural. He wrote that the narrator is clearly based on Frank Belknap Long, with whom Klein was well acquainted.
Ah, right, right. That explains it. Yeah.
They both lived in New York, didn't they? And there's a passage coming up in a bit, which we read last time. You know exactly what I'm on about. We'll cover it when we get to it.
Yeah. And it starts in almost a humorous way. Our poor guy is sat on a plane and someone has just splashed some vomit on his suit. And it's basically the elderly lady next to him has been airsick and dropped her bag and it splashed on his suit.
Yeah.
He doesn't seem too upset because he's already got a horrible stain on his suit from an earlier encounter. So he's not having a good journey, is he?
No, he's not. Madam, I said, think nothing of it. The suit was already stained. Such a nice man. She cocked her head coyly at me, still gripping my wrist. We're already into the uncanny valley here.
Yeah.
Everything it's one thing I love in these kind of stories is when you have that ultra mundane setting, but nothing's quite as it should be. You know, everything's a bit strange and off.
I was picking up on the descriptions of it because it's that you know when you're young and you had an elderly aunt or something perhaps, and they quite often seem quite sinister.
Yes,
it's that impression. He talks about her dentures, her hand clamped wetly around my wrist.
Yes,
it says, though their whites had long since turned the colour of old piano keys, her eyes were not unattractive, but her breath repelled me. Again, it's quite a vivid picture, and he's stuck next to her on a plane with her vomit on his suit now.
Yeah, it's not pleasant when that sort of thing happens. I remember being on the waltzers as a kid, and somebody had just eaten like a fish supper, you know. So yeah. Oh, it's a smell that I can never unsmell, you know.
And this earlier mishap, we're at Heathrow, we find out. Oh, one thing with this, I was going to say, this introduction, we learn all these things gradually. We learn his age, we learn what he looks like, we learn where he is, where he's going. It's all introduced very naturally in the text.
Yeah.
And I thought that was great because one thing I find writing myself, and also when I see it, is that sort of clumsy exposition, you know.
Info dumps.
Yeah, where John was a man of 35. He had bright red hair and was wearing a green suit. He had just got, you know, where this introduces it all very naturally.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that a lot of people do. I mean, I did it when I was very green. You're like, I need to let everybody know what he looks like, but no, you learn to drip feed it.
Yeah.
You know, just in little bits, like he brushed his black hair off his face or, you know, scratched his stubbly jaw.
Yeah,
you know,
because we don't really know anything about our protagonist at the moment. We do learn, however, that the earlier mishap had occurred several hours before when he was boarding the plane at Heathrow. I like this, surrounded what appeared to be a rugby club, all in blazers. If you've ever been around a rugby club, you'll know exactly what he's talking about. And he gets sort of shoved behind and he stumbles into a Chinese man who's carrying a black cardboard hat box in which he was storing his dinner, which is rather unusual in itself. And he gets something from the box, sloshes over his ankles, duck sauce soup perhaps, and left a sticky yellow puddle on the floor. And again, it's... I like that he ties this smell in with it. He catches the smell of treacle, and that gives him this instant childhood memory.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, all these things as well, even though they seem incidental, they all add in to the story. They all sort of come back to haunt him at some point. And then just after this, a beefy chap with an Air Malay bag and a beard so thick and black he looked like some heavy from the silent era sort of bustled past him. Shouldered him aside with shoulders broad as my valises. He pushed his way down the crowded passage, head bobbing near the ceiling like a gas balloon, and suddenly disappeared from sight at the rear of the plane.
And again, it's nice because that feeling of someone's head like a gas balloon, like almost like a featureless floating oval, is quite sinister again, isn't it?
Yeah, I was instantly brought to mind of Junji Ito's Hanging Balloons.
Oh yes.
Have you read that? Yeah, with people's faces appearing on balloons and basically hanging them from it. It's really strange, but that's what it reminded me of.
So this old lady has seemingly not finished her heaving. There could be more on the way. So he asks to change seats, and he's steered down the aisle towards the restroom at the middle of the plane. And again, you get this little mention, just a passing mention. To my left, a cadaverous young woman wrinkled her nose and smiled at the man next to her. Cadaverous.
Yes. Yeah.
Again, it reminds me a little bit of Jacob's Ladder, the film, where that guy keeps getting the glimpses of, and I'm sure it's been used in other films as well, but particularly strong in that one.
Yeah. Well, Jacob's Ladder is an absolute masterpiece, and yeah, yeah, very much so. Yeah, you have this other nice little mechanic going on at the moment, and it goes on all the way through, is that while he's narrating what is going on around him, he's also having a sort of internal conversation with his old pal, H.P. Lovecraft. And he's thinking about the fact that Lovecraft didn't like to fly.
Yes.
And that he'd only gone on one plane. And only for as long as $3.50 would bring.
And he would have hated commercial airliners because it just speeds everything up again. Even in Lovecraft's day, well, especially in Lovecraft's day, the world was getting faster and faster. And that trend continues today.
God. Yeah.
What would he have made of TikToks and Reels? And there's barely enough time to get one word out.
Oh, I know.
Sesquipedalian. Oh, that's it. Your time's up.
He'd never get past his return address, would he?
So he sits in another seat and he happens to notice that the person next to him is the big guy with the beard who is taking a nap.
Yeah.
And this is where finally, getting a bit of peace, he settles down to take the paperback back out of his pocket, which he mentioned earlier. And this is a paperback of his own stories entitled Goose Pimples, 13 Cosmic Chillers in the Lovecraft Tradition.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this. So this is what I was reduced to. A lifetime's work shrugged off by some blurb writer as worthy of the master himself. The creations of my brain dismissed as mere pastiche, and the tales themselves, once singled out for such elaborate praise, were now simply, as if this were commendation enough, Lovecraftian. Ah, Howard, your triumph was complete the moment your name became an adjective. I love that.
That's nice, isn't it? That's nice.
Yeah.
And you could kind of see a point. I don't know if any of those sort of members of the Lovecraft Circle ever wrote about that particular issue, but Lovecraft is very well known now, even mainstream. But how many people have heard of Kuttner or Long or et cetera, even Clark Ashton Smith, who we think of as a big name.
Yeah.
You talk even to people who know Lovecraft, and not many of them know about Smith. Howard, Conan, people know. But it wasn't a case of Lovecraft being the big head of this group, was it?
No, not at all.
It was all collaboration. They were all very much on an equal footing.
Yeah, I wonder if it rankles some people about being often compared to people like Stephen King all the time, even though they were around before,
All that Lovecraft is very much like Stephen King, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
So we continue this Uncanny Valley theme because the man who's asleep next to him now, the bearded man, he takes a closer look at him, and it looks almost as though this beard is unnatural. It almost looks as though he can see the ghouls where it's stuck onto the face.
Mm.
And the skin that he can see, although burned from long exposure to the sun, has an odd pallor. And it described as, my gaze continued upward along the weathered cheeks towards the dark hollows of his eyes. They opened.
Mm.
And it's almost as though this man is waking up from a nightmare, because he opens his eyes. For a moment, they stared into mine without apparent comprehension, glassy and bloodshot. In the next instant, they were bulging from his head and quivering like hooked fish. His lips opened and a tiny voice croaked, "Not here." So obviously this gives him a bit of concern. He thinks, is this guy sort of all right? Is he...
Well, after sitting in silence for a moment, the man whispers, "Don't do it to me here."
Yeah, so it's like he's having this conversation with something or someone.
Which causes our narrator to ponder, was the man a lunatic? Dangerous, perhaps? Somewhat in my future, I saw spinning headlines, jetliner terrorized, retired New York teacher, victim.
one thing I like with this as well is the protagonist is very much got a writer's mind, because a lot of the things that happen, he spins off into these little flights of fancy, doesn't it? Much as you do when you see something, you think, oh, imagine if a giant bear came through the window then.
Yeah. I must admit, I was thinking in the dentist waiting room this morning, I was thinking of several shoggoths and things coming and so basically halting my appointment.
Did they give you gas? Did they give you Innsmouth gas? Don't have the Innsmouth gas.
Don't have the Innsmouth gas.
No, you wake up somewhere else totally different. It's not a pleasant experience, believe me.
Yeah.
And that's what this man says, right? He goes, "Oh, I'm just having a nightmare." And there's constant sort of references to his size as well. He shook his massive head. His voice had a hint of Tennessee drawl. Boy, I'd better lay off the kickapoo juice. I'm not sure what kickapoo juice is.
Well, our narrator obviously knew what he meant and said, that's an expression I haven't heard in years.
So this is where we get into this man's story. We find out he's a missionary, or he was until yesterday. And this section then leads us off with another Lovecraft quote. This from 9th of December 1925. Lovecraft wrote, "Missionaries are infernal nuisances who ought to be kept at home."
He has had some quite amusing quotes about religion and religious types. If you type in Lovecraft quotes religion on the internet, you'll come up with some quite scathing comments.
So we start to get this man's backstory, and it's interesting. Again, we sort of had the description of him, but almost by accident, because this was someone who bumped into him. Again, we don't know his name. We don't really know much about him at all. Yet we start getting this backstory, and again, all the information about him is gradually revealed.
Yeah. The first thing that strikes me is he mentions he had a distracted air. There was vague replies, preoccupied gaze. So again, masterfully, without saying the man seemed nervous, you know the man seems nervous.
Yeah. And this nervousness isn't a result of him making off with some tribe's treasures or something like that, or it's not
daughter.
It's not violated someone's daughter or anything like that.
Yeah.
He was working in Kuala Lumpur, and we get a few odd things already. It was in a place south of Kuala Lumpur, which seemed frankly incredible. Houses invaded by trees, government-built roads that simply disappeared. A nearby colleague returning from a 10-day vacation to find his lawn overgrown with ropey things they had to burn twice to destroy. And he claimed there were tiny red spiders that jumped as high as a man's shoulder. And a girl in the village went half deaf because one of these things crawled into her ear and swelled so big it plugged up the hole. So this is all very much steaming mangrove swamps, rubber plantations, and nature. It seems like a constant fight against nature just to survive.
It reminds me of a Carl Edward Wagner story. It's on in a Dark Place, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's about this rundown neighborhood, and there's an invasive weed, and it's basically consuming everything around them.
That rings a bell.
It's a really good story, and there's creepy little Arthur Machen-esque things living in the weeds.
That does ring a bell, yeah. But despite the hostility of the local flora and fauna, the people themselves are very friendly, and he's running a clinic there, and everything is fine. Everything's tickety-boo until, of course, he gets assigned a new mission, which is to travel to the interior, a place where the tribe there or the people there speak the old language, and they are known as the Chauchas. Oh, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Well, we find what it really is later on, don't we?
Yeah. And again, I don't know how to pronounce that either.
I'm going for Chocho.
Chocho, yeah.
Chocho. I'm going for Chocho. Yeah, Chocho.
Chocho. Yeah.
And again, even as this sort of story is going on, as the guy's talking, we get these odd others. They're not really incidents, but they're just little unsettling things. He stopped once more as if weighing whether to continue, and we get a Chinese woman plodding slowly up the aisle, holding onto the chairs each side for balance, which you see people do, right?
Yeah.
I felt her hand brush past my ear as she went by, and that's it. But again, it's just that vaguely, slightly unsettling experience.
And I think that's TED Klein's style all over. I mean, if you've ever read Ceremonies or anything like that, you'll know. I mean, that's what he does all the way through. And it is a brilliant way of building tension. Yeah.
So he travels to the interior. It's got an interpreter with him. I think a couple of guides with him as well. To meet, well, we'll say chochos, shall we, as we don't know how to pronounce that one. And I thought this was interesting. He thought at first they were primitive because they still observe a lot of these strange rituals. But after a while, he works out they're not primitive at all. They just kept the rituals because they enjoyed them.
That's sinister in itself, isn't it? It's I like that. It's nice.
And he's trying to do his missionary work, and they basically nod and smile at him. And I thought that was nice because this is that moment where they know more than he does. Again, it's that thing we see a lot of the so-called civilized or scientific man coming into the so-called primitive arena, but they actually know a lot more than he does.
Well, in the Events of Horror Farm and the Ceremonies, there's a character who's exactly the same as these characters that we've talked about many times, the old rustic, and he knows everything he knows what's going on, but nobody will listen to him. You know.
And his interpreter disappears before the first week was out. This is classic disappearing person, isn't it? We've been pacing out one of the fields less than 100 yards from the tents. I was pushing through the long grass thinking he was behind me. I turned around and he wasn't.
Yeah, and you get this thing now about, talks about down in the lowlands, an animal, a kind of snail. The Malays killed on sight, a little yellow thing, but it scares them silly. They believe that if it passes over the shadow of their cattle, it'll suck out the cattle's life force. They used to call it a chocho snail, and now I know why.
The colour yellow has implications in any Lovecraft story, doesn't it? So again, he doesn't have to explain that or point that out. Just merely putting that in a Lovecraft story, you've immediately got an association.
Yeah, it was the same back with the ooze from that guy's hat box.
Yeah,
the yellow is
it's not mellow yellow.
Not mellow yellow, no. Puffy grave worm yellow.
And this is where we get a jump scare, because he's telling this story, then all of a sudden there's this inhumanly high-pitched caterwauling that pierced the air like a siren, rising above the whine of the engines. All it actually is the guy behind has dozed off, dropped his cigarette on his lap.
Been there, done that, not fun.
That's it. It's great that you could smoke on a plane.
Yeah, no.
Oh
yeah.
God.
I did it in the back of a van going to a gig. I wasn't asleep, but the end fell out. It didn't land anywhere. You know, it was sort of on me.
Dangerous.
Yeah, no, it was out of my thigh, but that wasn't pleasant.
But it's interesting because this guy's reaction to that is way above what you might expect. You know, you expect everyone to jump, but my companion's mouth gaped as if to echo the scream. It's like it's gone all white and clutching at himself, and it's almost comical. So this guy is very much on edge. And it's at this point we learn his name, because he says he's bound for Florida for some R&R.
Yeah.
And for some reason, our protagonist says, "Oh, my sister lives there.
Indeed.
You could pop in and see her," and then instantly regrets it. And this is a little bit, it's almost that English thing again. "Oh, you must come and see us." No, we didn't actually mean it. You're just being polite.
Yeah. So you've always used to do it. I remember, like, as a kid, my granddad was like, "Oh, if you're ever in Macclesfield, pop and say hello." And then when we're driving back home, that idiot never turns up at our doorstep.
Exactly.
So, well, why did you invite him then?
I know. It's strange. That's one of those unwritten rules of sort of British etiquette, isn't it?
Yeah.
And he told me his name was Ambrose Mortimer. It means Dead Sea, he said, from the Crusades. Well, yes and no, because the actual source of the name Mortimer, it's Norman, and it's from a Norman village. So it's kind of right, because you've got the mort and mare, but the mare in that refers to a mere or a pond. So it's thought that in that particular village there was a huge stagnant pond, Mortimer.
Right.
So, but you can see where you can get the Dead Sea Association from, and then tie that in with the Crusades.
Oh, yeah.
So, who knows? But the Mortimers were a very famous family at them, and interestingly enough, they were what were known as marcher lords. So they were barons charged with protecting the Welsh border with England, which I thought almost gives us a Macanesque connection, perhaps.
Well, I mean, the whole Cho-Cho thing. It's been argued that the whole inspiration for that is Macken's little people, the dark, furtive folk that live in the hills and all that.
Oh, yeah. So, nice little connection there. I thought whether that is intentional on his part or not, I don't know. But very few of these writers put anything in by accident, do they?
No. It's I mean, you know as well as I do, we love it.
Yeah, Easter eggs.
Easter eggs, exactly. Yeah. I'm always putting stupid things in, and I'm like, I'm guaranteed that nobody will probably ever pick up on half of them. But if they do, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it's now that basically Mortimer says that he explains that he feels like he's been followed. And that even at Heathrow, he went into the toilets and he heard somebody singing a specific song. And why would anybody be singing? I mean, if they were following you, that's just it. I don't know. But I think it's part of the ritual. So you get this impression that, things are dire. Things are not good.
Yeah, and we get this idea of, I heard some of the Cho-Cho women singing it. It was a sort of farming song. It's supposed to make things grow, which we get a little more explanation about later on, though not, again, by far from a total explanation. So there's a lot in this that is left open, as of course there should be in any good weird tale. But as they get into Manhattan, we get the yellow again. Ahead of us loomed the saffron yellow smog that covers Manhattan like a dome. And this is where our protagonist is getting off, and Mortimer has to hang around because his flight to Miami doesn't leave for a couple of hours. And I like this again because having given the name of his sister out, once more I regretted my impulsiveness in giving him Maud's address. I was half tempted to make up some contagious disease for her or a jealous husband. It's just so. I mean, that's virtually every British sitcom, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
You then have to get into these elaborate lies and reasons why you can't do something you said you were going to do.
It's Faulty Towers. It's One Foot in the Grave. I mean, in fact, One Foot in the Grave have done an episode on this very thing of somebody turning up that they met on holiday.
So he thinks that's it. He probably won't go and see his sister anyway. He's out of there. He heads out into the airport until he finds himself in one of the airport gift shops. He's got to wait for his niece to come and pick me up. So he's got a little bit of time to kill. And again, very British. I'm surprised Klein isn't British, actually, all these things. Maybe it's an American thing as well. Having said this protracted goodbye to the person, that happens. You then see them again.
Yep.
Now it's really awkward.
Yeah. And I love this bit here because the missionary is browsing the paperbacks, the so-called classics section, haunt of the public domain. Love it.
It's like a pejorative term, it seems, isn't it? Classics in inverted commas and public domain.
Yeah.
So the missionary is there sort of looking up and down at the books, not really looking at them, but just killing time. For some reason, call it embarrassment, I refrained from hailing him. Instead, stepping back into the rear aisle, I took refuge behind a rack of Gothics. I wondered if that was a collective term for goths. A rack of Gothics.
Hey.
It's almost like spying on the guy now, because without warning, Mortimer turns and looks around. I ducked my head towards the Gothics and enjoyed a vision normally reserved for the multifaceted eyes of an insect. And Mortimer now starts flicking through albums. That's not stamp albums or photo albums. That's records. So I have to say, I can't remember seeing a record shop in an airport.
Oof, no.
I mean, you could think CDs and cassettes, but maybe there were back in the day.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I remember there used to be like a HMV in Manchester Airport.
Right. Oh, I guess.
There was like a HMV and a WH Smith's.
Yeah.
I
guess they must have carried records back in the day then.
Yeah.
And this is where we get our jazz reference you were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's looking through these albums and suddenly he gives a little cry and shrinks back. Then he whirls and walks quickly from the store, pushing past the family about to enter. And our protagonist is interested, so he goes over to see what album it was that caused this reaction. And it's a jazz record featuring John Coltrane on saxophone. And this began the search for the the unknown album cover.
Indeed. Yeah. I looked on several blogs as well. It's not just me that can't find it. Nobody can seemingly find what he's referencing. So whether some people think it's an amalgamation of a couple of Coltrane albums,
Yeah.
or that it was just a different jazz musician, or that he just made it up.
Yeah.
So either way, it's a stunning visual, isn't it? Coltrane stood silhouetted against a tropical sunset, his features obscured, head tilted back, saxophone blaring silently beneath the crimson sky. The pose was dramatic but trite, and I could see in it no special significance. It just looked like any other black man with a horn.
Yes. So this then makes you speculate that Mortimer must have seen something, because that's it's a response to something visual. We had the song, he heard what he thought might have been the song earlier, but now.
Yeah.
So that must reflect on something that he's actually seen before. So again, it's a way of getting that idea in without actually saying he saw a strange shape with an odd profile.
Yeah. And that's what it is, right? It's not the man itself that's caused this reaction. It's the outline. It's the sinister shape of the man with the instrument, which is, yeah, it's one of those things. It's very visual. You can picture it in your head. Even if you can't find the right sodding album, you can still picture that in your head, and you know exactly what he's talking about.
So from there, we get into what we could call the New York section of the story. His niece comes to pick him up. We get another quote from Lovecraft heading that. New York eclipses all other cities in the spontaneous cordiality and generosity of its inhabitants, at least such inhabitants as I have encountered. That's 29th September 1922. And of course, this is what we were referring to earlier, because the last bonus episode we were looking at Dreamer of the Night Side, which was Long's recollections of Lovecraft, particularly in New York, because Lovecraft, of course, spent time in New York. When he married Sonia Green, he lived in New York for a time. And there's lots of little references in here, I think, isn't there?
Because in that, there's the whole section where Lovecraft was describing it as almost like Arabian Nights scene, wasn't it?
Yeah, the Manhattan skyline, he said, reminded him of like sort of a Dunsanian setting or something, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got here, how quickly you changed your mind. You arrived to find a gold Dunsanian city of arches and domes and fantastic spires, or so you told us. Yet when you fled years later, you could only see alien hordes.
And we think we reflected at the time of his initial sort of stay in New York, or certainly when he met and then married Sonia Green, was a very happy time in his life.
Yeah.
And of course, after that, this was the scene of his divorce, his failure, and everything else. So naturally, some of that fed over into his view of the city, I guess. I mean, as well as, of course, his in his unfortunate racism and all the rest of it.
Indeed, yeah, and it's nice that TED Klein has obviously read Dreamer on the Night Side, right? Because I mean that is basically almost word for word what Lovecraft was saying. And again, it's obviously he's had the same sort of thoughts that we did. What was it that so spoiled the dream? Was it that impossible marriage?
Yeah.
And
the racism is referenced here as well, quite clearly.
Indeed. Yeah.
It was, in fact, a thorny problem, forced to choose between whites whom I despised and blacks whom I feared. I somehow preferred the fear. Because, as we know, Lovecraft was also quite a snob in a lot of ways, and he had issues with almost everyone. Yet the sort of paradox of it is, as we discussed last time, the members of the Calum Club were Jewish and gay, and his wife was Jewish, and from very different backgrounds as well. But they weren't sort of dilettantes or anything. A lot of these, I think one worked in a bookshop, and they weren't sort of your Rockefellers or anything. And Long states in there he never heard Lovecraft ever be rude to anyone, or he always treated everyone with courtesy. Yet at the same time, there's that other aspect to him. So
Yeah, he was a complete dichotomy in a lot of ways. It's like on the one hand, he was the perfect gentleman, and then obviously he harbored these abhorrent thoughts. He's very complex chap.
So this gets us into the Natural History Museum, which again was a place that we know Long and Lovecraft frequented.
Indeed.
And this is where he gets to see the Black Man with the Horn for the second time.
Yeah. And this, to me, brought back a story we covered 2 or 3 episodes ago, Long's The Horror from the Hills.
Yeah. In a sense, that's one reason why we covered this story, wasn't it? Because
it was,
when we spoke about Chalgner Fawn, this story naturally came up as a sort of... it's kind of an offshoot of it in
Indeed.
a way, because it's a similar setup, isn't it? You've got a strange tribe, they worship something, and that something is now in New York. Especially
as it was said in that the Cho-Cho were sort of neighbors almost to the tribe that worshipped old Chorgy. So
yes, yeah. I mean, you can even speculate: is it the same thing? If you Google the name that comes up later for this entity, about half of them you think are quite sort of Nyarlathotepian, and
indeed,
and the other half are very elephantine.
Yeah.
So we've had Malay and Malaysia mentioned a couple of times, and now this connection is made very clear because his young nephew finds something called tribal garment in the museum, Malay Peninsula Federation of Malaysia, early 19th century. And it's a stumpy figure in a glass case wrapped in ceremonial robes. The robe was spun of some shiny green material. Across the front ran 5 yellow-brown shapes in loincloth and headdress, presumably fleeing toward the robe's frayed edges. Behind them stood a larger one, all black. In its mouth was a pendulous horn. The figure was crudely woven, but it bore an unsettling resemblance in both prose and proportion to the one on the album cover.
It's a nice touch again that everything else is neatly labelled. And he says the provenance of the item, where it came from, who found it, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, they don't even have which tribe it's from.
But it does, he decides he's going to see if he can find out a little more about this. And this was great as well. He goes to the information counter in the main lobby downstairs and asks if there is any more information about this exhibit. And a bored-looking young college girl listened to the beginning of my query and handed me a pamphlet. That's so typical.
That's so well observed. That's the thing with this story and Klein's work in general. The observations are so spot on. Oh man, the amount of times I've done that. I've got to ask somebody a question and go, read the leaflet.
But inside that, he does find this. The model next to it wears a green silk ceremonial robe from the Negri Sembilan, most rugged of all the Malayan provinces. Note central motif of native man blowing ceremonial horn and the graceful curve of his instrument. The figure is believed to be a representation of Death's herald, possibly warning villagers of approaching calamity, probably Cho-Cho in origin. So there we get the proper name for the tribe, the Cho-Cho, and this idea of this figure being Death's herald. And this is what shocks him, right? Because he's heard of the Cho-Cho before.
Yeah, because he's figured in a number of tales by Lovecraft and his disciples. Howard himself had called them the holy abominable Cho-Chos, but I can't remember much about them except that they were said to worship one of his imaginary deities. For some reason, I'd always associated them with Burma. But whatever their attributes, I'd been certain of one thing. The Cho-Chos were completely fictitious. Obviously, I'd been wrong.
So this is one of the nice things we say about Lovecraft, right? Because we know he weaves factual things in with fictional, particularly in terms of books. So it could well be that you think the Cho-Chos are fiction, but they could have been real. As it turns out, they're not. But it wouldn't be unusual to find that in Lovecraft.
No, absolutely not. And that's the beauty of that whole sort of thing, isn't it? Dropping in just enough truth to make the lie seem believable.
Yes. So that gets us into the next, chapter or section. And now we're into letters. So appropriately, the Lovecraft quote from the 23rd of December 1917, very early, is epistolary expression is with me largely replacing conversation. Well, that was certainly a trend that continues throughout his life.
Wasn't it just? I seriously think that, especially towards the end of his life, if he could have communicated entirely by pencil and paper, he would have done.
And this starts with a letter from his sister, which includes a clipping from the Miami Herald. Clergyman missing in storm. The Rev. Ambrose B. Mortimer, a lay pastor of the Church of Christ, Knoxville, Tennessee, has been reported missing in the wake of Monday's hurricane. So he gets this sense that, as he says, Mortimer, having fled one peninsula, has strayed onto another just as dangerous, because, of course, Florida is a peninsula. And in some ways, I guess in climate, not that far removed from Malaysia. Steamy, humid.
No, especially, yeah, all the swamps, the Everglades and all that, yeah.
And I like the way the peninsula is described as a finger thrust into the void, and the void had swallowed him up.
It's better than what I've often heard Florida compared to in shape. Looks a bit like another appendage if looked from certain angles.
Yes, yes. And there was a nice word here, I thought, as well, this nice phrase that I'd not heard before. So he describes how this news sort of depresses him a bit. And he says, I've often been prey to depressions of a similar nature and subscribed to a fatalistic philosophy I shared with my friend Howard, because Lovecraft was, as you said, a nihilist, basically.
Yep.
And a philosophy one of his less sympathetic biographers had dubbed utilitarianism, which I thought was a great word.
Yeah, and that's got to be a dig at Lesprague de Camp, right? It's got to be, hasn't it? One of his less sympathetic biographers.
Totally unsympathetic biographer.
Yeah.
But he does take action over this because he thinks perhaps Mortimer was done in by this strange cult, this lunatic religious sect. So he writes to the Miami police. He talks about this idea of ritual murder and the Malayan tribe and the Cho-Cho and everything else. And you might think the police would get that and just chuck it in the bin, really, because it's quite a strange one. But they write back to him.
Yeah, Detective Sergeant A. Linehan. In the matter of the Reverend Mortimer, we had already been appraised of the threats on his life. To date, a preliminary search of the Pompano Canal has produced no findings, but dredging operations are expected to continue as part of our routine investigation. Thank you for your concern.
Yeah, and there's a handwritten postscript under that says you may be interested to know that a man carrying a Malaysian passport occupied rooms at a North Miami hotel for most of the summer and checked out 2 weeks before your friend disappeared. So his sister then backs this story up because she sends another newspaper story sort of a week later that names this Malaysian citizen. Records indicate that the Malaysian Mr. D.A. Jakarta Chow had occupied furnished rooms at the Barclay Hotel. And he is basically a wanted person in connection with this disappearance. And more than that, there's a photo with that article as well, which, dun, 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 he recognises as the man who spilt his dinner on him.
Yeah. The yellow oozing there.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that touch. It's just, tying out all these incidental details, sort of weaving them into the overall narrative. It's masterfully done.
Yeah, and just to round that section out, he also discovers something that was found in Mortimer's room. Apparently the poor man must have been deathly ill, maybe even tubercular, because it seems that in the Reverend's bedroom they found something very odd. They said it was pieces of lung tissue.
Human lung tissue.
Yes.
Lovely.
That's some cough.
Yeah. This next Lovecraft quote is interesting because, again, in Dreamer on the Night Side, in the beginning bit, we zoomed past it because it was all about stuff about Lovecraft's early life. But Long mentions in that as a child, HPL had his own little kid detective agency And when they didn't even do like firefighters or something as well, and things like this, it would be like organized like a stuff like a fire brigade or something. Yeah. But here we go. The quote is, "I too was a detective in youth." So I thought, nice. There's another nice little callback there.
I suppose this was the era of the detective, wasn't it? I mean, we'd had obviously Poe sort of invented it in a sense, but then Sherlock Holmes would have been very well known to these guys, and you're getting into all those Edwardian, your Carnackis. There was a whole host of Edwardian detectives, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, and obviously Christie.
Yeah.
But by the time when this story was written, there'd been a big sort of upsurge in that kind of fiction again. We had all your P.D. James and your Ruth Rendells and all these sort of almost the second wave of detective fiction writers.
Yeah. So this is where he turns detective, and Maudie's sister is sending him through information. And she's even spoken to Sergeant Linehan a couple of times, but she learns something. She hears something from one of her bridge partners who's got a friend in the police force. And we learn that the search for Mr. Jaktu was being widened to include his presumed companion, a Negro child, or so my sister reported. So it starts getting even odder. This man is traveling with a young child.
Yeah.
Seems a very odd thing for a sort of, if you think he's a hitman or a murderer or something, to be doing. Perhaps it's bring your kid to work day.
And of course, this brought to mind the figure on the robe again, and apparently he'd been having nightmares about this. He saw a chap, a beggar, huddled against Roosevelt's statue, coughing his lungs out into a sort of twisted horn.
And the whole atmosphere changes now. We've been talking about, we've had sort of swamps and jungles and sunshine. Now we're in chill New York. It's grey. It's cold. He's wearing a muffler. He's got his tweed overcoat on.
Yeah, I must admit, I punched the air on that. Grey tweed overcoat. Nice.
But he's going back to the museum to have another look at this. And inside the museum, the heating is on too high, which again, in public buildings is quite often. September, the heating goes full on, right?
Oh, mate. Yeah. It does me in. I don't cope with heat that well. So when I go in a shopping centre in like the end of summer, it's just like, oh.
And the place now is empty. And again, even the atmosphere in here is quite creepy. The corridors are silent and empty, but for the morose figure of a guard. We've got the hiss of the steam radiators near the marble ceiling. And he retraces his earlier route past the immense skeletons of dinosaurs. These great creatures once trod the earth where you now walk. And he goes down to see the robe, but the robe is not there. The glass case is empty. And this is nice because there's a little card on there that says the exhibit has been removed for restoration. So he goes down to the main lobby, and the summer student is obviously back at college now.
Yep.
And he's actually got a helpful woman at the information counter who's quite keen to give him the information. She actually gives him a pink slip that means he can go down the stairs and see the exhibit where it's being restored, which is quite a thing, really, isn't it? To be able to go.
Yeah.
It's almost like backstage, isn't it? You've got a backstage pass for a museum.
Well, back into harsh reality again when he gets down there, because there's a chap down there, isn't there, who's less than thrilled about all of this. I suspect that in view of my age and grey tweed overcoat, he may have taken me for someone important. A plump young man with sandy-coloured beard, he looked like an out-of-shape surfer, but his sunniness dissolved when I mentioned my interest in the green silk robe. And I suppose you're the man who complained about it upstairs. Am I right?
And though he assures him that he isn't, he just seems to ignore that, and he seems convinced that this is the person.
Yeah.
We can only speculate on who this person was who came in to make a complaint. Apparently, they threatened to call the Malaysian embassy. So that implies it's a person from Malaysia. Is there another one of these Cho people or someone from that area tracking him now? You know.
Well, that's the implication I got. which obviously comes around in the end, doesn't it? It's interesting here because the disgruntled worker, so some damn tourist maybe in town for a day and out to make trouble. If you put up a fuss, those people upstairs get scared that it'll wind up in the Times. Now, this is interesting because the narrator then goes on to say, I understood his illusion. The previous year, the museum had gained considerable notoriety for having conducted some really appalling and, to my mind, quite pointless experiments on cats. That is actually a true thing.
Ah, right. I did wonder because it seemed like an odd thing to put in. I mean, it sort of fits in with this idea of things being not quite normal, but I wouldn't have guessed that this was an actual thing. Wow.
Yeah, I actually tracked it down. It's in the New York Times archive. The article was dated July the 19th, 1976, and it appeared on page 31. And it basically goes on to say that the American Museum and Natural History have spent almost $500,000 over the last 15 years in a study of the sex lives of cats, involving experiments that animal rights groups have deplored as cruel and inhumane.
Oh, what year was this again?
1976. Not long enough ago.
I mean, what the actual fuck? This sounds like
horrible. Isn't
I was
it?
listening to the HP podcast guys. They was covering the island of Dr. Moreau Wells.
Oh yeah,
which is like what Victorian Edwardian setting, I guess. And even back then, there were anti-vivisectionist movements going on. As you can imagine, part of the theme of that story is experimenting on animals. But this was 1975?
1976.
1976. That's outrageous.
It's mental, isn't
Disgusting.
It's seriously horrible.
So when you know that, I suppose it makes, I don't know, it makes it even more creepy and horrible, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? Well, it makes this next bit when they're going down this corridor, and he says, on your right, the infamous zoology lab. I kept my eyes straight ahead as we passed the next doorway. I smelled a familiar odor. It makes me think of treacle, I said.
Yes. He said, well, you're not far wrong. The stuff's mostly molasses, pure nutrient. They use it for growing microorganisms, which, of course, ties back in with that earlier song, which was a song to help things grow, right?
Indeed.
So it's another little bit of the puzzle sort of falls into place.
Yeah, and the snails and the yellow goop and the hat box that had the goop in it.
His dinner, in inverted commas.
Yes.
So he's taken into the room and the robe is brought out from him by this guy who we learn is called Richmond. And he says, it's not really in such a bad condition, is it? And I realise he still thought of me as the man who complained. So the complaint must have been about the state they were keeping this thing in, perhaps. And again, we see the small brown shapes still pursued by some unseen doom, with the man, the black horn to his lips, a man and horn, a single line of unbroken blackness. And he says to Richmond, well, what can you tell me about this fellow, this figure? And he just says again, the same as said in the pamphlet, really, Death's Herald, supposed to warn of some approaching calamity.
Then when Richmond's gone, he sits and thinks about what he'd just seen on the robe. And he thinks that the small brown shapes, crude as they were, had expressed the terror no mere messenger could inspire. And that great black figure standing triumphant in the centre, horn twisting from its mouth, that was no messenger. I was sure of it. That was no death's herald. That was death itself. So basically, he leaves then, doesn't he, and goes back to his apartment just as the phone's ringing.
Yeah, well, this next section, now we've had detective. Now this gets us into the book section. I like the way each little chapter or section has a particular theme, if you like. So he's going to start doing his research now, like all good Call of Cthulhu investigators. And again, this whole scenario, this whole story, you could see as a scenario, right? It has that kind of detective-y sort of feel about it.
Oh, yeah.
And the first book he mentions is Jungle Ways by that old humbug, William Seabrook. Now, this is a name that wasn't overly familiar to me, and I'm not sure why, because I thought I should have known about this guy. He was lived 1884 to 1945, was an American occultist, explorer, traveller, journalist, and writer.
Serpent and the Rainbow was him, wasn't it? That's what the Serpent and the Rainbow, the movie, was based on his studies of Haiti and zombies and all that.
Right. Yeah, because basically he travelled around. He travelled to Africa and various other places. And one of the most notable things I found was he claimed to have seen a tribe, and they allowed him to watch a ritualistic or a cannibalistic ritual. And there were various claims that he was allowed to take part, or was he? But he did say, or he did state, that he later on obtained samples of human flesh from a hospital and cooked it himself, and then reported and wrote how it tasted and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And there was also another rumor that this was also done at a sort of a dinner party he put on, or a wealthy socialite put on. And you can kind of imagine that, can't you? With decadent socialites, it's something they might like to try.
Yeah.
But he was also involved with Crowley, who spent a week with Seabrook at Seabrook's farm. But in all, it didn't really come to a very good end. In December 1933, he was committed at his own request to Bloomingdale, a mental institution in New York City, for acute alcoholism. And he eventually, in 1945, committed suicide by drug overdose. But I feel that's a character or a person that might be interesting to look into.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the book. I think it was something. It's almost innocuous sounding, like The Mysterious Island or something. But that was all about Haitian voodoo, and that's where the film The Serpent and the Rainbow came from.
Yeah, it was the Magic Island.
The Magic Island, that's it. Yeah.
And that book is credited with introducing the concept of a zombie to popular culture. So there we go.
Indeed.
So we've got Day of the Dead and all the rest. We've got him to thank for all those.
Yeah, well, that's how I know so much about him, because I got a book on the history of zombie cinema right from the start. And obviously he comes up in it quite a lot.
So there we go. Oh, yes, you mentioned the phone ringing, and that's his sister calling, who is phoning to let him know that another man has gone missing. A busboy at the San Marino, which was a sort of diner close to his sister's house where he and his sister used to eat. They say he went outside with a bucket of fish heads to dump in the creek, and he never came back.
Yeah, it's definite echoes of that guy on the mission, isn't it?
Yes. And she took Ambrose there, which is the connection, of course, because he says, well, so what? Well, she took Ambrose there a few times. That was where we used to meet.
Yeah, this is where the penny drops that Maud had been considerably better acquainted with the Reverend Mortimer than her letters would have led one to believe.
Which makes you wonder, doesn't it? A little bit of speculation in that.
Doesn't it?
And this is where we get, I think, one of my favourite Lovecraft quotes, which, of course, again, pertains to the theme of this chapter. I couldn't live a week without a private library. 25th of February 1929.
Well, isn't that quote actually on the Innsmouth Book Club podcast logo?
It certainly
I thought
is.
it was.
It certainly is. So now he describes his collection of volumes, thousands of thousands, a cumbersome private library. And that's the main reason why he stayed in one place for so long. I mean, imagine packing all those books up to move.
Yeah, been there, done that.
This is where he goes into the library. This is where he starts doing his research.
Yeah, and he basically looks for anything he could find with Malaya in the title, doesn't he? And came across Wedding Rites and the Death of Thorns and a certain cave inhabited by millions of snails, though I find no mention of the Cho-Cho and nothing on their gods.
And he says this is odd because these days, in modern times, I mean, this is pre-internet, but even so, even my 12-year-old nephew can get hold of the Encyclopedia of Ancient and Forbidden Knowledge, you know. And then also we get this lovely line. Now, this is that change in text we spoke about at the beginning.
Indeed.
Because my copy says, if the Necronomicon actually existed, it would probably be out in paperback with a preface by Lynn Carter.
Yep, as does mine. But if you got a copy of Cthulhu 2000, or there was I think there was a 1993 was the first time the change appeared. That line is changed to say a preface by Colin Wilson, because by this point, Lynn Carter had written the Necronomicon translation by John Dee. So TED Klein thought it'd be quite amusing to change it and include another one of his mates instead.
So that's life imitating
Indeed,
art.
yeah.
Because I thought this was a bit of a dig at Linkart
Oh,
doing
yeah,
that,
yeah.
but that's the chronology of it. Was that
Yeah,
happened
yeah.
after? So
Yeah, it's brilliant,
great.
isn't it?
That's great. Yeah, so he doesn't really find anything until he comes across this transcript, a mimeographed film script based on a film shot in 1937. So he makes his library roll because this is quite an obscure thing to find. It's under a book. I think he's drawn to it because there's a book called Malay Memories by a Reverend Morton, which proved a disappointment, but he finds this transcript underneath it. And this is basically a sort of documentary, Malaya Today, financed in part by the US government. You've seen those kind of films, right?
Oh, yeah.
They did them a lot in the old days, didn't they? Here's France. Here's the people of France going about their business. It sounds like one of those kind of things.
Yeah, we got them at school. You know, we got them at school, like the language classes, like the same sort of thing, you know. Here we are in a French delicatessen. Here's how you order cheese. Fuck off.
Here comes a jolly chap on a bike.
Yeah, public information films. Those public warning films were absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, especially the kids ones, aren't they? Those,
oh, yeah, no, yeah. That's what I mean.
Don't go swimming in the river and all that stuff.
Don't play frisbee near a pylon.
Well, yeah, talk about harbinger of death. In a lot of those, you actually had a death figure, didn't you, lurking around somewhere?
Yeah. Some creepy old dude in robes, often, wasn't it? Yeah, it was all a bit.
No wonder he turned out the way he did.
Yeah, exactly.
So he finds this transcript, and it's the final section that proves of interest. It recorded a number of brief scenes that must never have appeared in the finished film. And he quotes one of them here, and it's in a playroom of a church school late afternoon. And the interviewer is saying, this Malay youth has sketched a picture of a demon he calls Shu Garon. I wonder if you can tell me something about the instrument he's blowing out of. It looks like the Jewish shofar or ram's horn, which we mentioned earlier. No need to be frightened. And the boy replies, he no blow out, blow in. And the interviewer says, I see, he draws air in through the horn, is that right? And the boy, crying by now, says, no horn, is no horn, is him, which to me was a straight up reference to the King in Yellow, right? I wear no mask. Remove your mask, sir. I wear no mask.
Yeah. Well, it's a very chilling line, that, isn't it? It's again, this is one of them stories that I'm surprised there hasn't been an adaptation.
Yeah, you'd think this would be quite an easy one to do in that there's no big monster reveal. Or perhaps that's why people don't do it, because nowadays you've got to see the big thing, or, you know.
Well, it was like that adaptation of the Mezzotint. They had to put the monster in at the end, didn't they? Sort of thing.
Yeah. So that leads us into the next section, which is now based in Miami. And of course, we get the Lovecraft quote, Miami did not produce much of an impression, 19th July 1931, because, as we know, despite being called a hermit and all the rest of those things, a recluse, Lovecraft travelled widely, including spending time in Florida.
Well, didn't you say that when he was down there, he went to an alligator farm or something?
Yeah. And he wrote that he liked the heat, he liked the warmth. You know, it was the cold that Lovecraft didn't like. This idea that he was shying away from sunlight like some sort of vampire is just ridiculous, you know. So he's speaking to his sister about this name, Shu Garon. Now, the proper spelling, I'm not sure about the exact pronunciation, would be S-H-U-G and then O-R-A-N. O-R-A-N in Malaysian, of course, means man, as in orangutan, man of the forest. So some say that shug oran, the shug, means to sniffle or search for, and also often refers to an elephant's trunk. So there we get that Chalgnar-Faunian idea of, I hesitate to say the phrase, the elephant man. Right?
Indeed, yeah. The elephant in the room again. Yeah. It's interesting because some people have, because I've read a lot of blogs trying to find out about that sodding album cover. And some people like think, oh, because of the way it says that it's a shog off. I don't get shog off from this at all.
Not in the least. No.
Not in the slightest. I don't get shog off at all. I mean, the only other thing that it kind of reminds me of is old Nyarlathotep. But even then, it doesn't fit with the lore of Nyarlathotep.
Well, this is the weird thing, because I have seen something written on a couple of websites that Shugoran was invented by Henry Kuttner as an avatar of Nyarlathotep, but I can't find any other reference to that anywhere. Presumably, if it was invented by him, it would be in one of his stories somewhere. But I've not been able to track any down.
I don't remember seeing that.
No, so I don't know if any of our listeners has got any more information on that. I've not read a lot of Kuttner. I have to say I've got one of his books on order, but
I'll have to dig out. I've got the Book of Iod, which is all of his Cthulhu mythos stuff. I'll dig into it.
yeah,
I'll dig into it this week.
because again, this idea of him being an avatar of Nyarlathotep, I can kind of see it when you see those depictions of Nyarlathotep with just a huge tentacle coming out of the face.
Yes,
That's quite a common depiction. So I can kind of see that, and obviously the Black Man idea, like the Black Man in the woods and that stuff,
and the witch cult, and that kind of thing. Yeah,
but nothing else particularly seems to fit. But then why should it? This is the Cthulhu mythos.
Exactly. I mean, to me, it's all because obviously, if we go along with what Joshi says, and what is pretty obvious that the narrator is Frank Belknap Long, I mean, it makes perfect sense. And you've got the Cho as well. To me, it's short of form,
Yeah. And again, this journey to Florida, to Miami, we still get the continuation of the low-key strangeness, I suppose you call it. The very passengers around me seemed participants in a masque. The oily little steward who smelled of something odd. The child who stared and wouldn't look away. The man asleep behind me, mouth slack, who chuckled and handed me a page ripped from his in-flight magazine, November puzzle page, with an eye staring in astonishment from a swarm of dots. So it's, probably just normal people, but again, is this just his outlook? Is he being tainted by what's happening to him?
Yeah.
Or is this his writer's imagination at work again?
Yeah. I mean, the inconsequential but very strange details brings to mind a lot of Thomas Ligotti's stuff.
Yeah. He
does that a lot. And again, it's all, is it the work of an unreliable narrator? Is it psychosis? Is something messing with him? It's left ambiguous.
And his sister Maud is there to meet him at the airport with news that they found the boy who went missing at San Marino. They found his body washed up on a distant beach, lungs in mouth and throat. Inside out, she said, can you imagine? It's been on the radio all morning with tapes of some ghastly doctor talking about smoker's cough and the way people drown. Quite gruesome.
It's grim, isn't it?
So then we get this drive to Malthouse, and even here again, everything just seems a little bit off kilter. Some of the older women were nearly as bald as I was. Men, like women, wore clothes the colour of coral, lime and peach. They walked very slowly as they crossed the street. And we get here too, a kind of languor was upon the block, one into which I knew with just a memory of regret I would soon be settling. Life was slowing to a halt. The only things that stirred were the geraniums in Maud's window box, trembling slightly in the breeze I couldn't even feel. So I suppose that's a reference to Florida being the retirement place, right? That kind of our version or their version of Eastbourne.
Eastbourne, yeah. That's how I've always seen Florida as, Eastbourne on a much larger scale.
Yeah, bit warmer.
Yeah.
Or as Eddie Izzard said, because he's from Bexhill-on-Sea, people come to Eastbourne to retire and then they die and then they move to Bexhill-on-Sea.
Yes.
So he continues his detectiving and is off to the Berkeley Hotel where the Malaysian chap was staying and is trying to get into the room that the guy was staying in. But the Cuban guy behind the counter has not been there for long and doesn't know anything about it. So he just takes any room. And this is where we get this. It's almost quite, it reminded me of Michael Shea again. Just the feeling and the seediness. He gets a room facing the rear. The place smelled vaguely of salt air and hair oil. The sagging bed had served many a desperate holiday.
Yes, and lots of desperate nookie on that desperate holiday, I imagine, as well.
That's quite a good phrase. Desperate holiday is quite grim as well.
It is, yeah.
And he's also continuing his research for this name he's got, Sugar On, and he finds reference to it under a variant spelling in the reminiscences of a Colonel E.G. Patterson. Despite the richness and variety of their folklore, however, they have nothing akin to the Malay Sugar On, a kind of bogeyman used to frighten naughty children. The traveller hears many conflicting descriptions of it, some bordering on the obscene. So that takes us into the end of the story, really. And it's quite odd in a way because it doesn't end with a bang, does it, really?
Oh, no. It ends with creeping realization, which I think stays with you quite well when it's done well.
Probably more so than having a monster come in the room and attack him and that kind of thing. Yeah. Which would be, quote, a normal ending for a quote horror story, right? And even getting into that, this is played down quite a lot. It's fairly low key because he goes back to his sister, who's in very agitated state. She's been trying to reach him all morning. He spent the night at this hotel hoping to, I don't know, find something. But his sister had awakened to find the flower box by her bedroom window overturned and the shrubbery beneath it trampled. I don't know if this is the flower box that he referred to earlier with
the geraniums,
wafting in this unfelt breeze. Down the side of the house ran two immense slash marks several yards apart, starting at the roof and continuing straight to the ground, which is quite a terrifying thing when you think about it.
Yeah. And also, if you think back to what he said about the geraniums, they were blowing in a breeze that he couldn't feel.
Yeah.
Were they being sucked at by this trunk-like appendage?
Yeah, was something sniffing for him.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we get that connection there. There was the puzzle mentioned earlier. The man on the plane gave him the puzzle. And here the tale degenerates into an unsifted collection of items which may or may not be related, pieces of a puzzle for those who fancy themselves puzzle fans, a random swarm of dots, and in the centre, a wide, unwinking eye. I mean, there we've got our sort of three-lobed burning eye imagery almost, haven't we? Or the eye at the top of the pyramid or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that relates straight back to a lot of Lovecraft ideas and concepts. You know, the blissful island of ignorance, but if you piece all these things together, etc., etc.
Yeah. It does remind me of the sort of denouement of Call of Cthulhu, like when he puts it all together and then finds the narrative, the Johansson narrative and all this kind of stuff. It's the same sort of thing, isn't it? Putting all the bits together and then wishing you hadn't bothered.
Yes. Well, it's sort of warning to the curious again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And even his sister picks up on this because she's sending him sort of cutting. She's moved out of the house by now. She doesn't want to stay there. This experience has terrified her. She's moved out. His return to New York, catches a chill and is in recovery for some time. But his sister sends him a story that she'd found in the Inquirer about the thing like a vacuum cleaner that snaked through a Swedish sailor's porthole and made his face all purple. She wrote at the top, "See, right out of Lovecraft." So it's a sort of referencing of the Lovecraftian in a story that sort of got Lovecraft in it, in a sense.
Yeah, that's what I mean about the fourth wall breaking, but it doesn't seem forced or overly like the author's trying to be clever. There's a purpose for it, which sometimes I think people forget with that kind of thing.
So that's pretty much it. Now we bring the story full circle back to the start again because his sister passes away, so he goes to Florida for the funeral. He didn't know that she'd been in ill health for most of the previous year, but he cannot help thinking that the so-called incidents may have hastened her death. These were senseless acts of vandalism directed against lone women in the inland South Florida area, culminating in several reported attacks by an unidentified prowler. So again, there's nothing directly to link that to what he's finding out, but there's an implication. And he ends up having gone to Florida to take care of his sister's affairs. He ends up staying in her house, basically. He doesn't really like the thought of going back to the New York winter. He can't bring himself to sell the house. He feels as though he's trapped here, but it's a trap he's resigned to. And at the time, we go back to the beginning of the story, I like this. The calendar on the wall tells me it's been almost 3 months since I moved in. Like he doesn't know. He doesn't know that. You wouldn't need to refer to a calendar to know how long you've been living where you've been living, would you? You know. So it's almost like he's sort of detached from the world now. And these incidents, well, in the past week, there's been a new outbreak of them. Last night's was the most dramatic by far, when a Mrs. Florence Kavanagh was about to close the curtains in a front room when she saw peering through the window what she described as a large Negro man wearing a gas mask or scuba outfit. The police turn up and they favour the scuba theory, since near the window they've discovered footprints that may have been made by a heavy man in swim fins. Now, that's totally Innsmouth, isn't it? That,
isn't it?
There's lots of heavy men in swim fins.
Isn't there just? Isn't there just?
But they haven't been able to explain why anyone would wear underwater gear so many miles from water.
I love that. Is that trying to rationalize the irrational, isn't it? It's the, you know, it was a man in a gas mask or a scuba outfit, you know. and to me, again, the Doctor Who fan in me instantly heard, "Are you my mummy?" The gas mask, you know.
And he sort of ponders on this and he thinks, well, that woman's house, the little green bungalow, is just the same as his sister's house. And maybe the thing just got the wrong house. And so now he's sitting there waiting for it to turn up.
Call it an aging writer's ego, if you like. But somehow I can't help thinking that last evening's visit was meant for me. These little green bungalows all look alike in the dark. Well, there's still a little night left outside. Time enough to rectify the error. I'm not going anywhere. So he's kind of resigned himself to his fate here, hasn't he?
Yes. Yeah, the final line is, tell me, Howard, how long before it's my turn to see the black face pressed to my window? And again, with Lovecraft or some other writers, it wouldn't be unusual at the end there to have, oh, the face, the window kind of ending. But it's not. It's left on that, like you say, it's fade to black. The guy is sitting there on his own. The clock is ticking slowly. Tick, tick.
I was going to say, you could hear the ponderous tick of the grandfather clock. Yeah.
And we just fade out. Yeah. Splendid.
It is a brilliantly effective story, even though, again, it's one of those that there's no real action and not a lot really happens, but it's all implied, and I think sometimes that's more effective because it gets your brain to fill in the blanks.
And I think, like you said, that's prime material for an adaptation. Because I mean, you know, 50 minutes you could do that in easily. There's not a lot of background to fill in. There's not a lot of exposition as such, because you get that as part of his investigation and as part of his research.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if the lack of action would count against it in that sense.
Well, most directors would shoehorn some kind of jump scare in.
Yeah.
Because seemingly you can't have horror these days without a forced jump scare. And they're usually so easily telegraphed, aren't they? So you can see them coming a mile off and they're just not effective.
I mean, you've got that nice one in there on the plane, though, right? You've got the guy dropping his fag in his lap. Bang, that gives you a...
Yeah, there you go.
You know, but I don't know, I've just got a feeling at the moment. I mean, as far as guns go, that's not a debate I particularly want to get into. I'm not particularly pro or anti or anything else. But I just feel like almost everything I watch that's American at the moment, everything is solved with a gun.
Yeah.
You know, oh, look, there's a guy, and there's a gunfight. And, you know, it's almost like even in, I don't know, Angela Lansbury or something, she's going to pull out a revolver at some point. blow someone away. You know?
To be fair, it's happening in most British dramas as well, and you know, which makes it even more ludicrous because all of a sudden, like, you know, some spod that works down the post office who's out for revenge somehow manages to get hold of an Uzi. I mean, how? All right,
I mean,
how?
a shotgun, you could imagine, right?
A shotgun, yeah. I mean, that's not out of the realms, but it's never a shotgun, is it? It's always like a fucking Uzi or something like that.
It is strange, and it's a sad thing because then it becomes a thing like, oh, there's a face at the window, bang, shoot it. You know, so then you either got to get into, well, that kills it, in which case that takes away all the cosmic terror, or it doesn't kill it, in which case, where do you resolve it from there? You know, I just feel it's a very easy shortcut for filmmakers to have everything solved with blowing something up or blowing it away.
Yeah.
You know,
and there's a place for that. I mean, that's what action movies are for. But
yeah,
other things, you know, you don't need things like that. You don't need the $1 million special effects and all this other crap, you know.
Yeah, but mood is something that's been relegated, I think, isn't it, to the background, above spectacle, really. And like we said many times before, a lot of the new Avengers or whatever it is, or the Doctor Strange, I think, was the last one I watched, which should have been right in my ballpark because you got tentacles over New York. And I just got bored. I just thought.
I think that I haven't seen that one yet. I mean, I saw the last one I saw was the last Spider-Man one.
Yeah. And
it gave me a headache. Yeah. It was so quick. There's like all the jump cuts and everything right over that bridge, and you've got all this other crap flying around, these nano bloody drones and all this kind of shit. And I was just like, I'm not following this right now. I couldn't keep up with it.
Perhaps it's just our age, sir. We are both 160, so yeah.
Men in tweed, yes.
Yes, the age of men in tweed and the Magic Lantern.
The Magic Lantern, Phantasmagoria show.
Oh no, it's Terry Thomas in Fibes. With
the
hand crank projector of the lady.
Hand crank projector, yes. And the twitch of the moustache. Oh, Terry Thomas, king of the cads.
Good. So there we are. Now, we've spent quite a lot of time chatting about that, so I don't think we're going to be able to squeeze in Dagon Sack. Because the bus is waiting outside. Our driver is patiently waiting, and it is getting a bit dark. And as we always say, don't want to be hanging around in Innsmouth after dark.
Indeed.
So I think we shall get back on the bus. But before we do, I'd like to give a big thanks to all of our patrons and subscribers. And just to remind you, or in case you haven't seen it yet, you can now subscribe to the show on Buzzsprout. So as well as signing up on Patreon, where you can join at 3 levels, you can sign up also on Buzzsprout at tier 1, and that gets you the bonus content for the Innsmouth Book Club and Strange Shadows, our Clark Ashton Smith podcast. You get a quarterly PDF of Innsmouth News, which has news and articles and various other bits and pieces in. And you get free entry to a certain event that's happening later in the year.
Indeed. Yeah, the Innsmouth Literary Festival. Yeah, I've got a little bit of an announcement about that. That we now have the after party is confirmed. That on the evening we'll be moving, it's literally like a 2-minute stagger up the road to the King's Arms by the bridge in Bedford, and we have a secluded back room from 6 p.m. till midnight where we can, drink beer and talk tentacles. So sounds good to me. Sounds a good. Me, any excuse to go to the bar,
and to talk tentacles.
And to talk tentacles. Yeah, exactly.
And I know a couple of our patrons have already said they're coming along, so we're really looking forward to seeing you there. And of course, everyone else. We would say about half the tickets have gone already. We are limited in space in terms of the venue and seating and everything. So please don't leave it too long. We are about half full. And we're almost full with traders as well now. But we've got maybe 2 or 3 trade stand spaces left.
Yeah.
So do check innsmouth.uk for information on that. Okay, so yes, thanks again to all our existing patrons and subscribers. We have had some correspondence in as well from various places, but we'll cover that next time. We've got a few interesting comments and suggestions coming. Speaking of suggestions, what are we going to be looking at next time, Tim?
I believe we're going to be going over to the Picture House, aren't we? They're doing a late night showing of Stuart Gordon's adaptation of Shadow over Innsmouth, Dagon.
Oh, marvellous. Haven't watched that for quite a while.
No, same. I'm looking forward to it. I'm a bit of a fan of that.
Yeah. We've not been to the pictures here for a while, have we?
No. Will be interesting to see if we get a new Pearl and Scream.
Yes, I'm sure we will. And if the pilchard ice cream is still as disgusting as it always was.
Oh, you just say no to pilchard ice cream.
All right. On that culinary note, it's goodbye from me, Rob Whiten.
And it's goodbye from me, Tim Mendes.